Good morning. Welcome, colleagues and friends from New York and around the world. I'm Qing Gao. I'm a professor and director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University. Today's event is co-hosted by the China Center for Social Policy and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. Welcome. This is a lecture in our lecture series titled COVID-19 Impacts and Responses in China and Beyond. We have in previous lectures discussed the impact of COVID-19 on public finance, on local responses, on labor market and caregiver responses. But today's lecture is so unique. It's based on research, but it's also stories and the lives lived, the feelings people felt, the thoughts they had during the height of the Wuhan lockdown, which happened over 2 years ago. So I welcome you and I'm eager to hear today's talk. Let me introduce our speaker today. Professor Guobin Yang is the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the director of the Center on Digital Culture and Society, and also the deputy director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. He previously published 2 books, both with Columbia University Press. The first one was The Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China, 2016. And the next one was The Power of the Internet in China, Citizen Activism Online, 2009. That's the previous one. But today's book, I think we all are eagerly anticipating. It's called Wuhan Lockdown. So we will have Professor Yang present and speak for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. We will record the presentation portion, but not the Q&A portion. So I encourage you all to enter any questions you might have to Professor Yang in the Q&A box throughout the program, and we will turn to your question at the end. Thank you very much. Professor Yang, please, welcome.
Unmute myself, always forgot. Thank you so much, Professor Gao, for your very generous and kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for those who are on the other side of the ocean. I would like to thank Professor Gao and the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University for inviting me to talk about my new book. It's a great honor. So we all know that the lockdown of Wuhan started on January 23rd and ended on April the 8th, 2020, 2 years ago. It was an extraordinary period of life and struggle for Wuhan residents. Almost on a daily basis, there were emotional swings on social media in reaction to news of tragedy or hope or some other attention-grabbing public incident. There were lots of moving stories. So part of my motivation for writing the book, as Professor Gao just mentioned, was to document these stories of lived experiences so they can be remembered and talked about. So in this spirit, I would like to start by reminiscing what happened today, 2 years ago. February 11th, 2020 was an important day in the history of the Wuhan lockdown. The COVID situation was still uncertain. The number of infected cases had not stabilized. Dr. Li Wenliang had just died a few days earlier on February the 7th. And 1 day earlier, on February the 10th, the municipal government of Wuhan had just decided to put all residential communities under closed management, so-called 封闭管理. It basically prohibited residents from leaving their residential compounds. So February 11th, 2020 was a time of great fear and anxiety for the residents of Wuhan. So I searched my book and found multiple mentions of February 11th, 2020. At the end of chapter 1, I mentioned that on February 11th, the World Health Organization announced that the novel coronavirus would be named COVID-19. In chapter 6, on civic organizing, I wrote that one volunteer campaign launched its fundraising website on February 11th and reached their targeted goal of fundraising the following morning, just less than 1 day. February 11th, 2020 is also an important date in chapter 5 of my book. Chapter 5 is entitled Fire and Thunder. It has stories about the Fire Mountain God Hospital, 火神山医院, and the Thunder Mountain God Hospital. But it mainly tells stories about frontline health professionals as well as COVID patients in Wuhan. Several stories in the chapter happened on February 11th. For example, on February 11th, COVID-19 patient Annenberg, who was also a diarist in my book, her 89-year-old grandmother was hospitalized on that day, and her grandma would die of COVID in less than a month. And Annenberg would write about her experiences in the Thunder God Mountain Hospital, looking after her grandmother. Her story takes up several pages in the chapter. I've actually told her story in an earlier book talk, so let me tell a different story today from the same chapter, chapter 5. It opens with the story of Dr. Cai Yi, who was the head of the pain department at Wuhan Central Hospital. Wuhan Central lost 6 of its employees to COVID, including Dr. Li Wenliang. Dr. Cai Yi wrote about his brave colleagues, both dead and living, using his Weibo account. He wrote about their colorful personalities, their hard work, their sacrifices, and their humility and kindness. They were like character portraits. Readers found his postings both heartrending and inspiring. They jokingly called them pain-style postings, 疼痛体, because Dr. Cai worked in the pain department of his hospital. So what did Dr. Cai write on February 11th? He wrote about the death of Lin Jun. So let me read 2 paragraphs from the book. That's on page 91. The posting that made Cai Yi famous was put up on February 11th. A story about little people who died of COVID-19. It opened with 4 plain words. Mr. Lin passed away. Then it continued. Who was Mr. Lin? I don't even know whether his name was Lin Jun or Lin Jun or Lin Jun. Mr. Lin's given name is Jun, but Dr. Cai didn't know which Jun. There are multiple Juns, as we all know. But almost every old timer in Wuhan Central Hospital knows him. He was not the head of the hospital or the party secretary. He was only the owner of the small market at the entrance of our campus on Nanjing Road. Dr. Cai recalled what a wonderful person Mr. Lin had always been. With just a phone call to him, he would quickly deliver bottled water to a doctor's office. He would receive express deliveries for staff in the hospital. Hospital staff could take something from his store and pay it later. Sometimes, they forgot to pay, and that was okay. And Mr. Lin was always smiling and never complained. Dr. Cai lamented that there were many kind people like Mr. Lin around, and yet they were invisible. Quote, "It's only when they are suddenly gone that we discover how important they were," in our lives. So that's one story. Actually, these are two stories because it's both about Dr. Tsai and about the death of Mr. Lim. And these are the kind of stories I tell in the book. And the book as a whole focuses on storytelling. When I started writing the book, the crisis, as we all know, was still unfolding. No one knew when the lockdown would be lifted. There was a great deal of uncertainty and fear. And to make things worse, in March, the crisis hit close home in Philadelphia, where I am, in the US, in the world, and became really personal. The story of Wuhan became deeply entangled with US-China relations, with global geopolitics, with anti-Asian racism and hate crimes in my own neighborhood. I didn't want to write a conventional academic book about something very personal. I felt the most valuable part of the Wuhan lockdown was the experiences of its residents, and their stories need to be told. These stories are particularly valuable because they tend to be missing in our media coverage of China here in the US. On March 30th, 2020, the New York Times carried a story called the Quarantine Diaries. It offers fascinating glimpses into COVID diary writing around the world, supposedly. It covers diarists in Paris, Manila, St. Petersburg, Spain, and several cities in the United States, but did not even mention the existence of the mother of all COVID diaries, the lockdown diaries of Wuhan. That's why the stories of these ordinary people need to be told. But more importantly, the people produce just a huge amount of this kind of storytelling. It was just, whenever I thought about it, I feel like it was just nothing less than a miracle that people in Wuhan and many other parts of China took it upon themselves to document their daily lives, despite all the hardships of the pandemic. Some chronicle their experiences with audio recordings, videos, photos, and other artistic forms. And as far as I can tell, they produced more pandemic diaries than any other place in the world. Their diaries surely had the biggest social impact of all pandemic diaries. As we'll see later on, I'll say more about diaries. They are shared on China's popular social media platforms and reached publics at home and abroad. Sociologists have always used these personal records for sociological analysis. They are sometimes called documents of life, personal documents, personal records. They're unparalleled sources for capturing the visceral dimensions of everyday life. But I also think that these personal narratives in Wuhan that came out of Wuhan were not just representations of a history that was happening out there somewhere. They were part and parcel of the historical process, that the people participated in the making of history through their writing. An example is Fang Fang's diary. I'm just using familiar examples for, I think most of us are familiar with Fang Fang's diary. I could use other examples, but let me use Fang Fang's diary. When she started writing and posting her diary in late January, 2 years ago, she wanted to record daily life and the lives of those around her. So people outside of Wuhan could know what was happening on ground zero. But from the very beginning, as we may recall, her diary postings resonated with the experiences of readers. They moved many and linked people into online diary communities. That enormous social and emotional impact I still remember that for many people, reading her diary at the time became a daily ritual. They would wait until late at night to read her posting of the day. Later on, when Fan Fan's diary became a flashpoint of social polarization and was out of her own control, it shows still just as clearly how personal writing in the lockdown was part of the history-making process. So I wanted to tell the stories of these writers, diary writers, and readers, because their stories capture the experiences of the residents under lockdown. I also want to tell stories of the lockdown and the pandemic from their perspectives. Diarists usually wrote about their reactions to major issues or events of the day. They recorded their emotions and personal views. Sometimes they argue with themselves, they reflected on various things in life, about death, about life, family, children, education, lots of things. On the day of Dr. Li Wenliang's death, February 7th, diarists almost all wrote about their reactions in their diary about Dr. Li's death. Some describe their emotions in great detail. So when I tell the story of Dr. Li's death, I try to recount some of these reactions of these diarists. The same with public figures like the so-called wolf warrior diplomats, like Zhao Lijian and Hua Chunying. Mr. Zhao and Ms. Hua attracted a great deal of criticisms from Western media for their aggressive posturing on Twitter and at press conferences in Beijing. There were criticism of them on Chinese social media as well, but they were also praised a lot for fighting biased depictions of China in Western media. A number of diary writers applauded their behavior, and I cited some of these in the chapter on COVID nationalism. Diarists not only wrote about their reactions to people and events, they also wrote about their own actions, their own behavior, their own daily life activities. For instance, volunteers wrote about their volunteering work. Activists wrote about their organizing work, sometimes in great detail. So let me now move from chapter 5 to chapter 6 and share a few stories about civic organizing. Chapter 6 starts with the story of an animal rescue operation organized by a young woman. And let me read 2 paragraphs about her story. And that's on page 111 and 12. Gu Meng, the name of the person was Gu Meng. She's an animal lover in the city of Huangshi near Wuhan. Her dream is to live with animals, not humans. After Wuhan was shut down, pet owners who happened to be away from home could no longer return, thus leaving their dogs and cats alone. On January 25th, after seeing a pet owner's plea for help in a Wechat group, Gu Meng started recruiting with volunteers to help feed the pets. Her request was met with enthusiastic responses. Within just one day, she has set up 5 Wechat groups for volunteers in 5 different districts of Wuhan, about 1,000 people in all. One challenge Gu Meng faced was how to arrange for volunteers to enter locked homes without causing safety concerns for homeowners. Their solution was to request volunteers and pet owners to exchange copies of their ID cards. With the pet owner's permission, volunteers would hire a locksmith. The locksmith would open the locked doors for the volunteers, who would then feed the pets. The process would be live streamed for the owners to watch from afar, or recorded for viewing later. In the recording where Guomeng shared her story about animals in Wuhan, this was the audio diary, she audibly sobbed several times when she mentioned the pitiable situation of the abandoned pets. And she was moved by the work of so many volunteers who braved the risks of exposure to drive around town and feed the pets. One volunteer adopted 17 cats and 5 dogs. So I think this story of this volunteer illustrated several aspects of civic organizing during the lockdown. For instance, the use of Wechat for organizing, the creativity of the volunteers, and remarkable degree of trust among strangers. Volunteers used Wechat to take requests from pet owners and then dispatched individuals to enter pet owners' homes to feed the pets. This may sound very simple, but it required both creative use of social media and trust among all the parties involved. Recording or live streaming the whole process for the benefit of the pet owners was not only creative, it also depended on an infrastructure of pervasive social media and smartphones. Citizen-led volunteering was one type of volunteering during the lockdown. Party-led community organizations, 社区委员会, also organized lots of volunteering work. One story in the book is about a volunteer who signed up to do volunteer work with her community organization, which was a party-led organization. And she was assigned to help guard the entrance of a residential community, a residential community. So her story gives a good sense of how community lockdown was enforced during the closed management period. You know, the 封闭管理, really the harshest enforcement of the lockdown was in that period. And if it's okay, I will read 2 paragraphs about her story now. I think that's the last 2 paragraphs I'm going to read. February 20th, this was February 20th. It was still in the middle, you know, Wuhan went on closed management on February the 10th. So on February 20th, as noted in her diary, Miss Yan left home at 11:40 a.m. After passing several COVID checkpoints set up in the streets, she arrived at the gate of the community where she would work at 12:10. A community staff member, Sister Tang, was there. Sister Tang was explaining to her about her job when a person dressed in PPE showed up and asked whether there was a woman in her 50s living in this community. The PPE guy was looking for a suspected case of the coronavirus disease. After confirming that no such person lived there, he hurriedly left. At 12:30 p.m., 2 lunch boxes were delivered to the volunteers at the gate. At this point, Sister Tang's shift was over. Before leaving, she told Yan to watch out for an 80-year-old grandma who lived by herself in this community and who always wanted to go out to buy mantou, steamed buns. At 11:08 p.m., a man in his 30s walked by and asked for a pair of gloves. Miss Yan gave him the gloves and asked what they were for. The man told her he was going to visit his wife in the hospital, where he had to wear gloves to be allowed entrance. At 2:35 p.m., an elderly woman in her 80s appeared, and Yan guessed who she was. "Where are you going?" Yan asked. "I'm going to buy something to eat. I haven't had lunch yet." "How come? Didn't one of our volunteers send a lunchbox to you at noon?" No, I haven't had lunch, the old lady insisted. At this point, a patrol guard who was passing by intervened. When she heard the old lady hadn't had lunch, he offered to fetch her a free chicken lunch. But the old lady said she did not eat meat. I only want to eat steamed buns, she said. Miss Yan could now tell for sure she was the lady Sister Tang had told her about. The grandma eventually took some instant noodles from the volunteers and agreed to return to her apartment. So that's a story about a few people, volunteers and residents in a period of the closed management in Wuhan. Chapter 6 has other stories of civic organizing. For example, stories of psychological counseling organized by a couple of nonprofit organizations in collaboration with government agencies. There was an anti-domestic violence campaign organized by a group of feminist activists, or fundraising campaigns organized by online fan clubs, etc. All these are fine stories in their own right, but for readers not familiar with the social and political context and the meaning of volunteering and civil society in China, some contextualization is necessary. So in general, throughout the book, I try to provide as much context as possible for the stories that I tell, stories like these. I think when I was writing this, I thought context is especially important. I mean, it's always important for understanding different cultures and societies. And China is a particularly relevant case because mainstream media discourses about China here in the US often lack adequate context. So in this chapter, to provide some context for understanding the meaning of civic organizing and the stories of the individuals in this process, I compared civic organizing during the Wuhan lockdown with civic organizing after the Sichuan earthquakes in 2008. A main feature of civic organizing following the Sichuan earthquakes in 2008 was that NGOs played a prominent role, so much so that some Chinese scholars and NGO leaders at that time considered 2008 as the year of NGO and civil society in China. After the earthquakes, hundreds of NGOs descended on Chengdu to provide disaster relief. They organized fundraisers, mobilized volunteers. They built coalitions with one another and with government agencies. Their activities were widely covered in the mainstream media at the time. It's the wonderful support from nonprofit and civil society sector. But things were not quite the same during the Wuhan lockdown. Some nonprofit organizations were still active, but the number was smaller than in 2008. They also didn't usually call themselves NGOs anymore or civil societies, just grassroots organizations, 草根组织, or social organizations, more neutral kind of language. A great deal of civic organizing still took place, as I tried to explain in this chapter, but it was done often by individuals, like the stories I just mentioned, by online fan clubs. Alumni associations played an important role in the initial fundraising effort. In other words, by individuals or groups usually considered to be not very political. And the reason was because over the past decades, civil society organizations have become rather politicized in public discourses, both in China and in international media. In China, the discourse of civil society is considered too Western to suit Chinese reality, unlike in 2008, when the concept of civil society was still a key concept in public discourse with a great deal of legitimacy. But in this time, it was different. The concept, the language of civil society no longer enjoy the same kind of legitimacy in public discourse. Another interesting, important feature of civic organizing in the Wuhan lockdown was the role of Wechat and Weibo and other social media platforms I mentioned early on, like also live streaming platforms like Douyin. And that's different also from 2008. Internet was important in 2008, but neither Wechat nor Weibo nor live streaming platforms even existed. Luntan, BBS was still, online communities were still important in 2008, but now it's a different kind of social media world. During the lockdown, these new platforms became essential tools for both individuals and citizen groups to organize and coordinate activities, as well as daily life, grocery shopping, and so on. What about censorship, right? During the lockdown, Wuhan lockdown, lots of it, lots of censorship. But did censorship stop people from talking, sharing, complaining online, even protest online? Not quite. I think in the past decade, besides the raw methods of deleting postings and blocking websites, one of the main forms of internet governance, is the Chinese language of a concept of 治理 or censorship, really, was to try to contain the vociferous cyberspace in the name of reason, civility, and positive energy, 正能量. There is a point to that, to some extent, because there is a great deal of disinformation online. A lot of harm is done. But at the same time, voices of criticisms and protest are also suppressed in the name of civility and positive energy, because these voices are usually very emotional, so that sometimes they're considered as irrational. The official slogan is to keep cyberspace bright and clear. So that's the goal of internet governance in the past decade. It's not an easy goal to achieve in ordinary times. I think it worked quite well to a certain extent, but it was quite impossible to achieve in the lockdown period. The pandemic was mentioned earlier, an emotional roller coaster. Everyone had pent-up emotions to let out, and their main outlet was social media. You really couldn't stop them, unless you shut down the internet. But by now, close to 70% of the population was online, and internet had just become such an essential part of our lockdown life. I think it was hard to imagine shutting it down. So the coexistence of dynamic online expression and censorship is a persistent feature of Chinese internet culture. But I think it was still quite remarkable that online expression was very strong and lively during the lockdown. And it was not only essential for civic organizing, in many other ways. The proliferation of online voices, including the voices we've heard so far and many others, had an unintended but important social effect. It built a sense of national solidarity in a way that I think Twitter or Facebook did not. Social media in the US were all already polarized before the pandemic. They were not getting any better during the pandemic. Chinese social media has some degree of polarization, and that persisted during the pandemic, even intensified to some extent, especially during the conflict and controversy over Fang Fang's diary. But in general, I think they help the online discourse, help to produce a strong sense of togetherness during the Wuhan lockdown. I think the sharing of personal stories, including the sharing of personal diaries, had a lot to do with this. Personal stories express personal feelings, and this helped others to read them, to release their own feelings. And the effect, I think, was a kind of collective catharsis. I cited in the book, I cited many voices of this kind, close to 50 diarists, individual diarists are cited in the book. Of course, each of them wrote many entries. A lot of them wrote from the very beginning of the lockdown to the end of the lockdown. That's 76 days. So that's 76 diary entries. And some of them continue to write afterwards. And imagine, so many people were writing and posting these stories online. But also importantly, these were shared on social media, usually on Wechat, public accounts, or on Weibo. Some of these diaries, diary entries like Fang's, but also Guobin, right, and Xiaoyin, the poet in Wuhan, attracted a lot of readers, and readers themselves contributed comments. There were a lot of interactions, sharing of their own experiences in addition, after reading these diary entries. So that's why I thought this was the kind of online diary communities formed around these kind of personal storytelling. Some diaries were published after the lockdown. I think at least half a dozen have been published, but I feel that it's a pity that these published diaries did not include reader comments, the interactions. And in a way that I feel that the online diaries are peculiar genre, that without the comments and the interactions, it could not be considered as complete works, right? That the original context, the processes of interaction was an important part of the meaning making of that process. So all this was happening on a daily basis for extended period of time. And I think, again, I mentioned this unintended social impact. It wasn't intended like that. There were also voices of protest and criticism, angry voices, but somehow people were glued to these voices, right? I know myself and people I know were spending a lot of time reading these postings. So that's why I will argue that unintended, they sort of produced an unintended consequence of building sort of emotional social solidarity, bringing people from different parts of the country together. So I'll end with one example, one more example, and just I realized one more quote actually. And this is familiar example. I want to use familiar examples. Is the Wuhan auntie who cursed and swore loudly at the party secretary of her residence community, and also at the manager of her neighborhood supermarket. She was angry because she thought they were not doing a good job helping residents during this very special period of close management, right? As recently as the Xi'an lockdown, we can recall there was similar problems when difficulties with grocery shopping, and this was one of the issues during the Wuhan lockdown as well. And she was very specifically complaining about this because the supermarket in her neighborhood was trying to take advantage of residents by selling bundled grocery to them, right? You only want tomatoes and carrots, but then they also would you have to buy toilet paper together and other things. So she was so angry. She shouted, screamed at the manager and the party secretary on her. They're in a Wechat group. The audio file of her swearing speech, and so it was instantly named on social media as Hanma, right? Swearing, Wuhanese swearing. It was posted on social media, became viral, and I think it won a lot of applause. I usually try to understand the major incidents and events in the middle of the Wuhan lockdown from the perspective of diarists or other people who were there. So as much as possible, I would cite other people's reactions to these events. And like earlier on, I mentioned that a lot of people wrote about their emotional reactions to the death of Li Wenliang. Other cases like Dr. Ai Fen's story, people, the diarists wrote a lot about her as well in that period. And not surprisingly, people wrote about the Wuhan auntie swearing speech. And one diarist, which I cited in the book, wrote that the swearing speech, which was made in very strong Wuhanese dialect, had cathartic effects in a city in distress. So here is what the diarist wrote. I'm quoting from this page. Let me find the page number. Okay, so this is on page 59. This story is in chapter 3, which is called People's War. So it's actually full of very loud stories like this one. The diarist wrote, "The Wuhanese swearing of the Wuhan County stirred up your feelings like waterfalls pouring down high mountains." I think my English translation is just much less powerful than the original Chinese language, but still, it conveys the sense of the power of the feelings expressed in this swearing speech. It showered thorough joy and gratification on so many Wuhan people. To be fair, she scapegoated community workers for the ineptitude of the government. All the resentment people had accumulated in their hearts poured out with the rhythmic rise and fall of the top grade Wuhanese swearing. They're small, so I won't read the whole passage, but what the diarist here was saying was, the powerful impact of just one viral video on the people in Wuhan at that very moment. It was like catharsis, emotionally very, very powerful for them. So I think these are some of the stories I tried to write and document in the book. And there are many others. I could go on, but I think I should stop here. It's a good place to end, and I love to get questions. So Professor Gao, should I stop here?
That's totally fine. I think we can engage in a conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Yang. I was so moved listening to you talking about how you approach these stories, but also quoting and reading these stories. I'm deep into reading your book, and just thank you for writing this amazing book.